The final handout that you're looking at for this particular class is called a coach's ministry tree. Some people would call it a family tree or a spiritual genealogy chart. It's an example of multiplication power. Now, I take a chance in sharing it because it's my tree, and I'm not implying that I'm anybody. But I'm taking the chance that in communicating this as a visual for you, that you could see how things reproduce and multiply if you just bring God your little bit of fish and your little 5 loaves, what that can look like in terms of impact. He promises that if you stay at this, that like Abraham, the sand of the seashore, as a picture of the multiplying power of God. This is His will. His will is that we reproduce and multiply. And so if we simply obey Him, which is simple, we didn't say it was easy, it's going to cost you your life. If you follow the simple obedience to the commandments and principles of God, the result is, as John 15, you're connected to the vine, you will bear fruit. As did the 3 sons. But they bore different levels of fruit by far. In fact, frankly, cracks me up that he pays a guy $400 to do the little that he did, and the guy who gave him his life, he only doubled his wage. It seems like it should have been $400 for one and $8,000 for the other instead of $800. That's just to say that when you believe God, trust Him, and do the right thing the right way and stay at it, that He's going to do far more than we can ask or imagine. And His promises of the nations will be your possession, the ends of your possession, is what's out there and possible by faith. By faith. Not for us, not to us, but to your name be the glory because of your love and your faithfulness. It's all about Him. It's from Him. It's to Him. It's for Him. Everything is about Him. As the Alpha and Omega, He chooses to use flawed beings who are submitted and surrendered to Him. And so this is just a picture that helps people expand vision with real humans, with real names that I can communicate because I'm part of this tree. Now, in this case, it's a coaching tree because my mentor, my father, in things of sport-related nature, his name was Frosty Westering. And he coached for 40, 50 years. He was at Pacific Lutheran University from 1972, 82, 90. He was there for 30 years and coached a net. Let's just take a round number, 40 years. And he had, in terms of players, that was not even counting his high school stuff. He had as players, let's take a number, let's say he had 80 players. He might have had 125 some years. He had 105 some years. He might have had 80 some years. Let's just take a number. That means that under his net, in his fishing pond, over his career, which was multi-decades, he interfaced with 3,000 or 4,000 players. Now, some of those guys were on the same team, so let's just say there's 2,000 different players. Let's just say there's 1,000 different players, because if there was 4,000 and if they were all there for 4 years and he had the same guy for 4 years, that would really be 1,000 players. That means 40 times 40 years, right, of coaching and having players under your system. Let's say there were 1,000 different individuals that he coached. That's not counting coaches that he had on the staff that was also in his fishing pond. Now, Frosty wouldn't say that he was an evangelist or a discipler, but what he did do is he created a culture where people of faith who had a relation with Jesus or didn't could come there and get to know Jesus or walk with Him, and he allowed for that to germinate and fanned it into flame with his own testimony that anybody who wanted to run with God could run as fast as furious with His blessing, and he even created opportunities for that to happen. And out of those 1,000 people, any one of which could have been touched by God and the grace and mercy of God and used by God to reproduce and multiply their life as Jesus reproduced His life in the disciples who reproduced their lives in their disciples, and thus we're here 2,000 years later. I use another man's example, another father of mine, spiritual father, Dr. Coleman, of which we've talked about, the Robert Coleman School of discipleship. And he was a seminary professor. He started discipling at around age 30. He's still doing it. He's 90, so we have 60 years. 60 years, of which he would work with about 12 or so seminarians, 3 different seminaries spread over 60 years, now retired, still working. He had 24 guys or gals, mostly guys, the vast majority guys, but he had some gals that were in his community of discipleship. That would be 25-ish a year, spread out over 60 years, which comes up to number about the same 1,000. And so he had a chance to impact directly in an intentional, strategic way, a quantity of relationship over a quantity of time, at least a semester, with these individuals who were there in seminary for the sake of their spiritual growth and their spiritual impact. Any one of whom might have been touched by God in His mercy and grace to reproduce and multiply. He, of course, was written the book on reproduction and multiplication, and so Frosty was doing by accident what Dr. Coleman was doing on purpose. And so the chances increase that if you do something accidentally, it's not as repeatable than if you do something on purpose and continue to practice it. Nonetheless, any one individual out of those 1,000 under either of those trees, this would be a discipleship tree at a seminary complex, or a coaching and playing tree in a sport-related context, any one of whom could be a reproducer or a multiply depending on the grace and mercy of God. And they both created a climate and a culture where that could happen, one accidentally, one intentionally. This is a picture of one of Frosty's disciples, learners. I followed Frosty. I learned from him. I was an apprentice of him as a player and as a coach. This is his tree of which I am a branch. But it's an example of what can happen if somebody catches the vision by the Holy Spirit's power of the possibility of investing in a few who reproduce and multiply. And so for me, in my own walk, I began an intentional approach to reproducing in 1992, which is basically 27 years ago, if I understand. So for 25-ish years, I've attempted, though I was never discipled, and though I'm sure I was mentored, sometimes maybe on purpose. I'm not aware of being mentored on purpose, and I'm sure people mentored me accidentally because I learned from people, good and bad, what to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say. But I did it without supervision, meaning nobody really had committed to intentionally and strategic walk with me, which means I made a lot of mistakes. I bloodied my lip a lot, and I bloodied a lot of other people's lips in my zeal and desire to God knows what, right? Both do my own thing and my agenda, and then, once transformed, want God's will instead of my will. Nonetheless, this is a coaching ministry tree. I say that because you'll notice under there is my name's Kess, it's Scotty Kessler. And to the left and right, there's names. Rich Kakmarinsky, Kirk Talley, Rod Olson, Randy Chambers. Oh boy, Bill Berghofer, Hordell Walker, Andy Lambert, Joel Penner. These guys are all head coaches now, some of them at multiple schools, that each of them have been coaching for from 10 to 30 years. They had under them or with them other assistants and players. Any one of those guys would have had 5 to 10 coaches on his staff with 50 to 100 players in his program that every year repeated with some adding and subtracting. This was done in 2006 or 7, which means it's maybe 12 years old. You saw the math in the multiplication table. When you take a number and keep doubling it, it looks small for a long time, and then the exponential, supernatural power of multiplication kicks in, it gets freaky. It gets freaky. So this list of names isn't 12 times bigger. It's to the 12th power bigger, whatever that looks like. And if you know how power works and stuff like that, 10 to the second power is 100, 10 to the third power is 1,000, 10 to the fourth power is 10,000, 10 to the fifth power is 100,000. Once you throw power into it, it moves way beyond addition. It gets into freaky numbers. But this is just an example of broken bread and poured out wine. This is an example of loaves and fishes and what God does in spite of us more than he does because of us. And so every one of those names is responsible for from a few years to decades of serving. And they're in Frosty's lineage because through me, I either discipled or mentored them. In our philosophy of sport that we call competing biblically, and our philosophy of discipleship, which we call discipling biblically. And these names on there represent names and schools that may have impacted not only players and coaches, but their girlfriends, wives, family lines, and other students. And so we have no idea how many people got the fallout of the power of God as each disciple down the line manifested the power of God in their own walk and their own influence and impact. And so it's a way to look at that and see that if you're just faithful with a few and you stay out over time and you teach them or model for them or both how to reproduce and multiply, how the math plays out in supernaturally synergistic ways, which is why Jesus was never concerned with 12 reaching 8 million 2,000 years later. It was just a matter of the right few reaching the right few to reach the right few. It was never about numbers because the math does not lie. And as you're faithful with a few and teach them to reproduce and multiply, God moves. On this chart in the top are all people that are in the sport of coaching, mostly football, but other sports. Under them are unknown tens and hundreds of coaches and players that may have been impacted in some way, either to move the ball forward in their life as just civilians, to be better husbands, fathers, friends, and workers, or move them to the side of the ledger from evangelism, the lost, to the saved, and move them forward in their walk so that they might be more impactful as husbands, fathers, friends, and workers in civil society or in the kingdom, depending on all kinds of factors of which we have responsibility to pray and to act. This is not counting people on there that are sports ministry people, that are pastors now, that are athletic directors, that are parachurch workers, that are coaching in other sports, that are business people, that are high school coaches, that are assistant coaches. This is simply a tree, and that are missionaries. This is simply a tree of head coaches. This isn't counting those who are now infiltrated the rest of society outside of sports into business, vocational stuff, or ministry, or stayed in sport-related fields. Only God would know the math here. And this is 12 years old, which means to the 12th power impacted other people who have become something, some of them for the kingdom, and others of them for society, and some of them still waiting to be saved. This is a visual example of the power of biblical discipleship. This is not about adding names to a sheet. This is about names on a sheet that have multiplied impact that we can't even put on there, because even one branch of the tree, of which there are many branches, could have its own stalk of fruit depending on how deeply the leader was connected to the vine. And so I hope it encourages you. The mistake would be to want that tomorrow. What you want to do is the right thing the right way and stay at the plan, so that as time goes on, the math will kick in. Again, that's an outcome. Some that you see and much that you don't see. I'm always touched when I run into somebody who I've never met who approaches me and asks about one of these guys who I do know that was either my son or my son's son, or brought up some name from the past that I might have coached a bunch of years ago that says, "You don't know me, but I know him, and he said you were impactful in his life." Now, as I've said before, and I talked about in this class, if you put $1 million on the table versus one life that has been transformed from hell to heaven through the Word of God and prayer, and they say that somehow in your flawed state, you had impact on somebody that impacted them, that moved them from darkness to light, that money is less than interesting. It's dross. The Bible talks about it as such, and it is true. Because a transformed life, once you have the Spirit of God with you, is priceless, and it lives forever with the King. And if that motivates you, then you will take steps to get in the sweet spot of God's will in discipling biblically so that you might walk with God personally for a lifetime, finish strong, reproduce, and multiply those that do the same. This is the Great Commission lifestyle.